Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. And before we get into the content of today's topic, if you haven't already, don't forget to like and subscribe so that you can help me in getting the word out there about using the skills of dialectical behaviour therapy and the theories of personality that we get from Schema therapy to effectively change those maladaptive and ineffective behaviours that we know as being addictive, obsessive and compulsive. Because everything we do in this type of work revolves around the principles of living the life you want to live, which basically means being the best version of yourself in the areas of life that are important to you, according to your true, authentic values and beliefs. And it's this way of being that brings me nicely into what we're going to talk about in this video today. One of the fundamental principles we need to bring a certain degree of understanding to is the acceptance of our unwanted behaviours being the solution to the problem and not the problem itself. Personally, when I actually started to look at my behaviours from an objective point of view, rather than the subjective perspective that my addictive mindset had me trapped in, it didn't take me long to recognise that I use substance to deal with an underlying issue. In essence, the substance, and later an awareness of a number of different processes too, were my coping mechanisms for all of the problems that I perceived to be in my life. Removing the maladaptive and ineffective solution was just the beginning of the work, because without the one solution, that single coping mechanism that I'd used for the vast majority of my life, my personality system was scrambling around trying to find a new all or nothing extreme way of dealing with the underlying problem. And one of the more common things that seems to show up when we start trying to define what this problem might be is the one thing that we're going to explore today. So let's have a conversation about the way we tackle one of the biggest issues that so many of us seem to struggle with, our deep-rooted fear of loneliness. In this type of work, definitions are incredibly important. So let's start this conversation off today by defining what we mean by loneliness. While there are a number of different definitions out there, particularly when we play the game of Google Psychologist, trying to find the one way of looking at things that fits exactly what it is that we're trying to find, for the purpose of this conversation, we define loneliness as the lack of emotional connection in our most meaningful relationships. And as the prominent academic researcher and social worker Brene once said in one of her TED Talks, actually one that at the time of this recording has over 22 million views on YouTube alone, I'll leave a link to the video in the description below. In order to make a meaningful connection, we have to practice vulnerability.
In order for connection to happen, we have to allow ourselves to be seen, really seen. And you know how I feel about vulnerability. I hate vulnerability. And so I thought, this is my chance to beat it back with my measuring stick. I'm going in, I'm gonna figure this stuff out, I'm gonna spend a year, I'm gonna totally deconstruct shame, I'm gonna understand how vulnerability works, and I'm gonna outsmart it. So I was ready, and I was really excited. As you know, it's not going to turn out well.
Vulnerability is one of the hardest things for us to step into, mainly because of the fear that we have for the guilt and shame that's connected to the story we hold on to about a catastrophic outcome that will undoubtedly happen if we step into the act of being personally vulnerable. But nevertheless, there's a hell of a lot of important research that suggests vulnerability is indeed what it takes to make an emotional connection. And defining loneliness from the perspective of emotional connection, or lack thereof it, gives us a clear distinction between loneliness and being alone. Loneliness has very little to do with being around people. Simply being around others doesn't mean that we're emotionally connected to them. It's also important to point out that some people need more emotional connection than others, so it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all approach that we're looking to employ here. If the struggle with loneliness is one that you can relate to, as it was definitely something that was at the core for me, then you're probably a person that recognizes you can be in a room full of people, but still have an empty sense of loneliness inside of your personality system. For example, when I was living the addictive lifestyle, and to some degree in the early days of my recovery, if I found myself surrounded by people, I was definitely not alone, but my internal sense of loneliness was so deep-rooted that despite the presence of others, there was still an emptiness inside, a void that I couldn't seem to fill no matter how many people I had around me. And while I spent a lot of time filling this void with the external things that are connected to substance and process addictions, they were simply the short-term ineffective solution when it came to the bigger picture. Now, you know what I mean. We're talking about the pig. And in all of my training and personal life experience, I've learned that loneliness seems to be connected to the unmet childhood need for attachment to others, which is one of the only unmet childhood needs that's present in almost everyone I work with that deals with addictive, obsessive, and compulsive coping mechanisms in their behavioral responses. In order for this need for attachment to be met in a healthy and effective way, we need to feel like we belong in our childhood environment. If we experience this feeling the majority of the time, it helps us to internalize this sense of belonging. We feel heard and understood, like we're accepted. People get us and we get them. We feel loved and wanted by the people we need to feel these things from. And when we internalize this sense of attachment, then we go out into the big wide world knowing there's a place where we belong. We feel worthy of acceptance for others, and we're willing to step into the possibility of rejection, knowing there's a place that we can return to where we're accepted and understood. No matter what happens in our relationships from that point on, the potential void of loneliness has been filled with the internalized sense of healthy attachment because we've experienced an authentic emotional connection in the relationships that are most meaningful to us. If we don't have this need met in a healthy and effective way, we don't internalize this sense of belonging, so the internal void of loneliness gets opened up, pushing this now overwhelming internal drive to find some sort of attachment to others. This unmet need can be created as a result of things that actually happen, or because of an emotional sensitivity that influences the childhood perception. But whichever way it plays out, we go out into the big wide world trying to meet the need for attachment, looking for other people to accept us, to see us, to hear us, to fill our need for connection. If we're lucky, we meet people that are grounded in a values and belief system that is similar to our own. And if we're extremely lucky, we meet people that are securely attached. These people help us to meet our unmet needs by providing the relationships that we're actually looking for. They demonstrate and model a secure attachment style which helps us to develop our own. Unfortunately, in most cases though, this doesn't seem to happen. We end up being drawn into relationships where people are trapped in their own behavioral problems, consistently acting out behavioral responses to their unmet childhood needs, much like us, in the only way they know how. And this is mainly because we're all looking to meet our unmet needs in familiar relationship dynamics, a familiarity that's connected to our early life experiences. We play out reenactments from our childhood, trying to fill the internal void with the perception of love and validation from those that are a representation of something or someone from our past. This is often a demographic of people that are so caught up in trying to be who they think they should be, fearful of being seen for what they think they are according to the maladaptive stories that they've created over time. And as a result, they don't allow themselves the vulnerability they need to be an authentic version of themselves. I was one of these people when I lived the addictive lifestyle, trying to be something that I just was not, fearful of being seen for what I thought I was, hiding my defectiveness in the shadows of my personality, hoping that it wouldn't get exposed. The irony of this way of being for me was that it actually kept me trapped, avoiding who I wanted to be. My true authentic values and beliefs were pushed aside so I could try to fit in, so I could finally be accepted and remove the sense of loneliness at my core. And again, the problem with this way of being is that we never truly feel accepted as we lack the authenticity that we need. So there's no emotional connection and the cycle of loneliness continues. This state of mind and the beliefs connected to the schemas behind it is often the driving force behind our behavioral responses in every interpersonal relationship we have. And as I'm sure you're starting to realize, it's the fear of loneliness, sadness, guilt, and shame that's at the core of our addictive, obsessive, and compulsive behaviors. We use these behavioral responses to numb the emotional pain, creating nothing but emotional suffering. And as with any of these ineffective behavioral responses, they are only helpful in the short term. In the bigger picture of living the life we want to live, they simply don't work. They keep us trapped in the addicted mindset that's connected to the problem with instant gratification. So if being vulnerable is the solution to the loneliness problem that we're holding at our core, isn't it just as simple as stepping into the fear with courage and compassion? You know, just being vulnerable then.
Do what the fuck?
Yeah, because it's always just that simple, right? Even when we take the plunge and step into the possibility of being vulnerable with others, it's usually the pig that keeps us trapped. For example, in some of my relationships, I was petrified of people seeing my defectiveness. This was the schema being held in my system that was driving my loneliness and shame. So when I learned that vulnerability could be the solution to my problem, I'd go into my relationships, both new and old, with this newfound knowledge. At first, I'd be just as guarded as I always was in the past, keeping people at arm's length, participating in superficial relationships, avoiding vulnerability in the only way I knew how. This was an old protection mechanism for the fear of shame and loneliness that I'd been using for decades. And while this was effective in the short term, it wasn't effective for me to live the life I wanted to live. But now things were different. I knew exactly what it was that I needed. So I was waiting for the other person to open up the door, the possibility that vulnerability was an option for me right now, a glimpse into the chance that you might actually like me, the possibility of a connection to experience the cure. Then, when this was something my new perception would allow me to see, my pig would kick in with full force. I'd rush into the vulnerability with an all or nothing approach, looking for an instant gratification of being validated, liked, and heavens forbid, even loved. Sliming people with my story, projecting big emotional experiences, telling them everything about my life and wanting more and more to be heard and understood, and even on the odd occasion, practicing the subconscious act of love bombing, hoping to receive it in return. As I've said, these behaviours were all linked to my problem with instant gratification, a new manifestation of an old issue. And I want to be really clear that there's nothing wrong with instant gratification per se. When it's the appropriate thing to do and when it lines up with living the life I want to live and being the person I want to be, it can be completely justified, which in some cases is definitely true in actuality. At the same time, dialectically speaking, we have to be really aware of our desire for quick fixes, for our avoidance of uncomfortable feelings, and the ways in which the behaviours that go with the pig can keep us trapped in old, ineffective beliefs. When in full flow, playing out automatically, all of these behaviours would create one of two things. They'd either get me caught up in the same old unhealthy relationships, ones that revolved around me people-pleasing, being codependent, being manipulated by people with narcissistic tendencies, or participating in an over-the-top, unhealthy sexual or physical attraction that just wasn't sustainable in any way. On the other hand, my exaggerated behaviours would cause the other person, someone who probably had a secure attachment style, to put up healthy boundaries, asking me to step back from the speed in which I was trying to move forward. In my addictive lifestyle, and to some degree in my recovery journey too, this was the last thing I had the capability to take on. It would activate my maladaptive and ineffective schemas, spiraling me into an angry protector mode that was pushing people away in an attempt to keep me safe. And as per the predictable process of the addicted lifestyle mindset, this would activate my guilt and shame, pushing my defectiveness front and center in my personality system, solidifying my loneliness as a story that was just fact. Sound familiar? The only way to work with this new version of the problem with instant gratification, one that's probably been around in our relationships for a while, but we just weren't aware of it, is to learn the art of what I call progressive vulnerability. This means having a serious understanding for our tribe, and in particular, the way in which we use the ever-decreasing circles of boundary setting to practice progressively increasing our level of vulnerability. The further out we are in our tribe, the higher the boundaries we set, and the lower the vulnerability we exhibit. As you move through the circles, boundaries start to come down, and as a result, vulnerability starts to go up. We don't rush in with all guns blazing. We take our time, slowly opening up, not only developing trust in others, but also in ourselves for making effective decisions. This means knowing the stories that show up inside of our relationships, which schemas are dictating our behaviours. Are we struggling with abandonment, social isolation, mistrust, emotional deprivation, emotional inhibition, or are we filled with a sense of entitlement that has us doing what we want when we want, regardless of the impact it has on others? What does it look like in our behavioural responses when our system takes the dominant schema and generates a critical narrative that sends us into the distress of a fear-based system? Noticing if we're in fight, flight, freeze, submit, or distract. And when we notice, activating the stop skill to practice cognitive diffusion, unblending from the part that's trying to have us act in ways that don't line up with who we want to be in these important and possibly meaningful relationships. When we use the skills of DBT to get into a wise mind state, we can make decisions based on both the emotion and the reason, using the light of values and beliefs to guide the direction we're traveling in. And all of this is achievable when we live a DBT life, not just knowing the skills of DBT, but living the skills of DBT every single day, making these choices a part of what we do habitually, and living the life you want to live by being the person you want to be in these areas of life that are important to you according to your true, authentic values and beliefs. Guys, I hope this video helped you to understand if you're struggling with a sense of loneliness, along with what causes it, and how we begin to meet the unmet need that drives the toxic shame beneath it. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you again soon in the very near future. Take care, be safe, and be well.